I'm still here.
Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 9, the final day of the 2024 World Championships Swiss stage. We are going to know our final 3 teams to qualify for the quarterfinals by the end of this video, and of course, the final 3 teams to be eliminated from the Swiss stage to not be making top 8. It's a lot on the line for these teams. You've got one more best of 3 to be able to win, and then you are into the bracket stage, the best of 5 stage. So again, a lot on the line for these teams. If you want to know how we got here, if you want to know my thoughts on how we got to each section with each team, you can check out all of the videos that we've done on the tournament up in the iCard in the playlist. We've covered every single game at Worlds so far. Of course, we've covered every single game from all 4 of the major regions all year long, and so you can check any of that out on the channel, but the Worlds playlist is going to be up in the iCard. Highly recommend checking out some of the videos from the past couple of days, the past, round, I guess, round number 4, if you will, because it's directly influential on how the matchups today end up going. But I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning. There's a lot of good stuff to get into today, especially today, because it's going to be the longest day of the Swiss stage here. We could be potentially getting up to 9 games in terms of what we're seeing across today. There are 3 best of 3s to go over, so definitely don't want to waste too much time. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and of course, I will be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series at the end of each series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. The only thing to preview at the end of this is the quarterfinals draw. We're going to know our top 8, and we're going to have a pretty good idea of the path that they're going to need to take in order to become world champions, and that is very intriguing, but that is going to be saved for the end of the video after we've gone over all of the games. Most of today will be spent talking about day 9, the final day of the Swiss stage. So without further ado, let's jump right into our first series of the day, and this is one of the more intriguing ones. 2 of the more aggressive teams, I guess is how I'd say it politely, the less macro inclined teams coming out from the East right now. It's the number 3 seed from the LCK in Dplus Kia, taking on the number 4 seed from the LPL in Weibo Gaming. I really like this matchup for both of these teams because I think they're both in similar positions right now where they have a ton of talent and they both proven that they can compete at a high level, but the upside is concerning, and especially the consistency is concerning for both of these teams. When you talk about DK, they started this tournament 2-0. They're sitting now here at 2-2. They've just not been able to win any sort of best of 3 so far. Most of that is because their schedule just got significantly harder than it was at the start of the tournament. They got lucky drawing Fnatic and FlyQuest early on, some Western teams, and then the moment they had to start playing some actually good teams like LNG, and then of course like Top Esports in the round after, they weren't able to overcome that talent gap, and they still have the same kinds of problems that they had domestically, which is that they look really good when they're able to push their advantages, in the late game, just kind of using their wallets and just outplaying their opponents in team fights, but when they actually have to out macro and out execute a lot of the teams that they're playing into, sometimes they can really struggle to hold on to the leads that they are able to generate. Adding that on to the fact that I don't think the players on this team have a ton of synergy together in terms of their play styles. You have players like Lucid and Showmaker that have been a lot more, I guess, invested into trying to play early and fast, especially recently. Showmaker really wants to get these early and mid-game leads, and then you have someone like Aiming who's basically just there for team fights. Kenyon, I think, has not really been good at this tournament, but when he's played well this year, he's been there for team fights. It just doesn't feel like a super connected roster in terms terms of playstyles, and we saw that really come back to bite them when they were playing the best teams in the world in the LCK playoffs. Now, you don't need to be the best team in the world to beat Weibo Gaming. We've definitely seen that over the course of this tournament as well, and we'll get to that in a second, but I do think DK needs to look better than what they have looked at this tournament so far. As I said in my previous video yesterday, at the end of that, when I previewed this, I do not think DK are favorites going into this series. I think they are underdogs in my mind, and that's because Weibo, I think, theoretically should be the better of these two teams. When you're talking about the advantages that Weibo has, what do, right? Well, they're one of the most, if not the most aggressive team in the early game in the entire world. They are so consistent at least forcing skirmishes. They're not always winning those skirmishes, but they are constantly looking to determine the outcome of the game as early as possible. It's something that's very comfortable for them, and that's always through Tarzan in the jungle. He has become the most aggressive early pather in the entire world. There's really just not a lot of players that can keep up with, how he wants to play out the first 10 minutes of the game, and the part that's scary is he can do it on so many different champions. You would think on champions like Sejuani or Maokai or whatever that you wouldn't necessarily want to be as aggressive early, but he has been so good in terms of being able to understand where his opponent is at any time and where his strengths are with his laners that he can actually just generate pressure on champions you wouldn't expect. And that's been Weibo's big X factor over the course of this year. That's what allowed them to get to the summer finals in the LPL. They should not have been a team that was anywhere close to that, but Tarzan was that good and was able to kind of get them there. I think Light is the other player that you have to point out. He's actually having a really good World Championships, whereas we're seeing a lot of AD carries step up at Worlds, but I think Light is definitely one of them. Xiao, who I think has been perfectly fine at this tournament. Breathe has had some good games, some bad games, but top lane, definitely a role you can take over on. I think Weibo has a more clear and defined playstyle. I think their players have slightly more synergy, but they're also more volatile. DK is pretty consistent in terms of what they are, and one of the things that I think was really well pointed out by the desk that I've been talking about a lot over the course of this year is that DK is really good at beating teams that they are just straight up better than. They are not a team that struggles a ton against teams that lack talent and consistency. And Weibo is certainly not a team that every single day is going to show up and dominate. And so I think it's very possible for DK to win this. I think if you get to the 2-2 stage, it's definitely not impossible for you to make the quarterfinals. But my prediction was definitely Weibo. Let's see if I am right. The only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Dplus Kia. They are going to take game number 1. They are going to go up 1-0 in this series, and this was one of the games of all time. A very sloppy, chaotic game number 1. I don't think this was as bad as some people are making it out to be. I think that there were definitely a lot of mistakes in the back half of the game, and that's more of what I would expect from these two. Both of these two teams are a lot more clinical early on and in the mid game than they are in the late game team fights. It's kind of been a struggle. A little bit less so, I would say, for Weibo, and we'll talk about that. They still struggled a lot in this game in the back half, but DK just needs to really lock in because this should have been a very easy win. They had a pretty gigantic gold lead going into the 20-25 minute mark, and they just were not able to close this out. It ends up getting dragged on and on and on, and these fights are way closer than they need to be. Eventually, they end up getting sold because Weibo just makes a gigantic mistake in giving that over to try and trade the Baron. Eventually, Weibo just gets hostile takeovered, obviously, because they're just sitting in the middle of the river, and the game ends after one really big team fight. It's a gigantic mistake from Weibo. They were in a position to potentially try and make a comeback from that position, but obviously one small mistake is going to blow things up. And it's not like DK didn't have a lead for a majority of this game. They had just gotten the Dragon Soul, and so I'm not going to sit here and say that Weibo was favored to win the game or anything. I think their execution in teamfights was really poor, but DK was definitely, I would say, a little bit lucky in terms of how Weibo ended up playing out the back half here. Player of the game for me, though, is going to go to Lucid in the jungle. It's really hard for me to give it to anybody else. I think Kingen, certainly someone I considered. Tank Callista for aiming, I think, is definitely something I considered, and if you have a different opinion than Lucid, that's totally fine, but I thought his mid game really was what separated him from Tarzan and really created that gigantic lead for DK. He was so constantly in good positions, and man, he is really good in team fights on Lee Sin. It's clear that he is a very practiced Lee Sin player, as basically every Korean pro jungler is, and it's funny because I expected to see a lot more Lee Sin at this tournament. I think Lee Sin's totally playable right now. He's totally fine in terms of damage. He can really do a lot in the early game, and he's not useless in the late game. I'm shocked that we haven't seen more Lee Sin at this tournament, and I think this might increase the play rate of a champion like that, because this was a really good showcase of why Lee Sin can be so valuable. It also was a showcase of what the downsides of this champion are, because he wasn't nearly as useful in the back half of the game when things started to, really break down in these 5v5s. That's just generically what happens to Lee Sin, but he still was relevant, and he was the reason DK had a lead going into the mid to late game, and so I do want to give him a lot of credit with that player of the game. Like I said, aiming though, really, really fun tank Kalista build. I think this is really smart in a game like this because it is very difficult to survive for a long time on the Kalista. You don't need a ridiculous amount of damage. You just need to make sure that you don't get insta-poked out by the Caitlyn and the Lux, that you don't just get dove on by the Nocturne and blown up immediately. As long as you can survive a little bit, buy some time for your team, you've got things like the Renata to be able to help you augment your damage, and I think aiming did a really good job in the back half of these games, doing well. The gold monster ends up striking again. Eventually, it's just like, man, this guy feels like he's doing nothing, and now all of a sudden he's got a 2k gold lead because he's just been in a side lane farming. Like, again, I'm not trying to completely shit on aiming. It's just, it's very funny how consistent it is that his playstyle is do nothing for the first 15 minutes and then, hope and pray that you have a gold lead going into the late game, and that's kind of what happened again here. I do want to point out Moham made some pretty critical errors on the Renata in terms of, like, the individual mechanics. Very funny. I can't imagine how Kellen feels right now watching Moham play his main and just not play it particularly well. Moham's never been a good enchanter player, even going back to his time on the Freaks, and so, I wasn't shocked to see him struggle at times here. That one big hostile takeover basically won them the game, though, at the end, and so you do have to give him some credit for that. Showmaker was fine here. The damage was pretty high, but the consistency was pretty low. It was very clear that Weibo was focusing him, but he wasn't the star this game, and I think that's honestly more of an encouraging sign that they can win without Showmaker just completely obliterating the opponent. I think overall this was a pretty good showing. Oh, Kingen was good as well. I think the Rumble damage was crazy in the back half of this game. Rumble is by far the best answer in the game to Jax. I don't really understand why teams are not picking this up more often, but DK looked really solid, I would say, in game number one. Like, you want to see some cleanup things at the end of the game. The team fighting was certainly not perfect, but I think for the most part, they were the better team, and I think they showed that off here. And then for Weibo, it's so sloppy. Like, you got to be more clinical. This is a quarterfinals qualifying series, and it feels like they don't really have a good understanding of how to play out the champions they individually drafted. I love this draft from Weibo in concept. Caitlyn Lux, I think, is very underplayed right now. Being able to generate gigantic leads in these lane swaps and be able to, essentially, she's Ziggs, but, like, actually can do a ton more in the mid game if you want her to. And Lux is obviously a problem that you can move around the map as well. I think they're very, very strong, and we saw that. Light and Chris were actually really, really strong early on. We got that bot lane 3v3 that ended up going in favor of Weibo to give them a gold lead early on in the game, but they just couldn't keep the pressure on it. I think a lot of that to me was Tarzan just not having a good game. He's going to get dead of the game here on the Nocturne. I just didn't feel like he was particularly comfortable on the champion, and that is a huge issue. If you're going to draft Nocturne Orianna, you have to be able to pull off the Wombo combo, and I don't think they did it once throughout this entire game. I don't think at any point the ball went on to Nocturne and he flew into the backline and tried to get a 4-man ultimate, right? Xiaohu was hitting good ultimates on the Orianna, but oftentimes it was off the back of Breathe or just generally on his own. It was a very weird execution of a comp that we've seen a lot over the course of this tournament, and I think that was problematic for them. Again, in isolation, I love this draft. I just think they didn't play well. Tarzan also just got completely outpathed in the mid game. You really shouldn't be losing team fights to a Lee Sin as a Nocturne when you have a gold lead. That's really not ideal. It's not something I want to see more of. Maybe this team going back to a more standard, draft, more of what we saw in the summer split could be more positive for them, because we've really seen them struggle at this tournament to be able to play these high octane, like, aggressive mid-game comps, and so we'll see what ends up happening, but I do want to talk about the positives. Breathe was excellent this game on the Jax. Jax continues to be a gigantic power pick in the back half of these games. As long as he's able to get to his power spikes, he's going to be able to influence basically any game or any fight that he's in. The Caitlyn Lux actually was really difficult to deal with. Light was doing so much damage in the back half of this game. They're just lucky that they were able to get on top of him in a lot of instances, and Xiaohu had a couple of really big ultimates. It just didn't really matter, and they weren't in the right spots. And so overall, like, Weibo, like, you can talk about some things they need to clean up, but they had a chance to win this game despite how poor of a position they themselves put themselves in. And so, we'll see what ends up happening in game number 2, but it's do or die. This is a best of 3. If you lose the first 2 games, you're out of the tournament. So gigantic game here for Weibo. Are they going to be able to stay alive and push us to a game 3? Or is DK going to be able to clean this up, show that they are the better team, and move on to the quarterfinals? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Weibo Gaming, they are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up this series at 1 apiece, and we are going to a do or die game number 3. This is kind of what we wanted to see out of these two teams. We wanted to see both of them show something in this series. I think Weibo's win in game 2 was significantly better looking than DK's win in game number 1, but we'll get to that in just a second. I'm just happy that both teams are showing up and showing that they deserve to be in the quarterfinals. I think that is definitely what we saw here, but this was not nearly as close as game number 1. Game 1, you had a lot of back and forth chaotic action. The teams weren't exactly playing all that clinically, and so you just got a lot of this flippy nature. You felt like anybody could technically win any fight at any time, even with DK having a lead. I would say especially because DK had a lead, but here in game 2, it was Weibo from moment, I would say like minute 10, and then onwards, it was just over. Like, there was no way for DK to be able to play out the rest of the game. The moment that Nocturne gets super far behind, the moment that Moham just completely runs it down in a fight, all of a sudden you're looking at a 3-for-1 in the middle of the map, and it's just, there's no, like, Weibo strangles you out. Like, there is no resources to get on the map, and the game is now over. Credit to Weibo. This is the kind of performance I was expecting them to have in a series like this. This is the kind of reason that I thought they were going to be favorites pretty heavily in a series like this, and I'm really glad to see that it's everybody stepping up. It's not one or two individual players. We will definitely talk about DK on the other side. I definitely want to talk about Aiming, who had a really good game, and just, it didn't matter, right? I think this is his best game of the tournament, and his entire team completely ran it down around him. But for Weibo, player of the game for me is going to go to Crisp. Multiple, like, flash 3-man knockups here from the Alistair. He is just such a playmaker from ahead. He is such a difficult support to end up trying to beat. You know, I talk about this a lot, but I think the broadcast has some sort of fixation on trying to make Crisp out to be, like, the weak link of this team, or somebody that is, like, really struggling on Weibo. He's just inconsistent. I don't think it's quite, like, you know, Hillisang levels of just, like, running it down for his team. I think oftentimes, you know, playing from behind, Crisp is a very aggressive player that's going to constantly be looking for options, and that can look bad when he is losing, and oftentimes it does look bad when he is losing. But man, when this team is winning, when Crisp is actually able to be this priority playmaker for them, he's one of the best supports in the world at that role, and we continue to see that. There are just not a lot of players out there that are quite as aggressive and creative in terms of engage angles as Crisp. When you look back to like 2019, this is just how he has always been. He's always been somebody that he's probably the best of all time at like flanking. Like, there is no player in the history of League of Legends that I think has been better at flanks than Crisp, and I think he continuously shows that off every single time that this team needs a priority playmaker, like I said, in the bottom side of this map to step up and really be the guy. But everybody was here in terms of damage. Dplus Kia making the fatal mistake of thinking that they can trade Yone for Aurora. Once again, this has not gone well for Aurora basically at any point throughout this tournament. I think the only time it did go well was for LNG against DK, or it was for Top Esports against Dplus Kia, because Top is just that much better than DK. Like, they are a full tier and a half above DK, that they could basically get away with anything. But these two teams are way too similar. Yone is so much stronger than Aurora and does so much more in the mid game, and we definitely saw that. Xiaohu was majorly influential throughout this game. He honestly probably deserves player of the game as well. If you wanted to give it to him, I certainly wouldn't be mad about that. Light was able to clean up quite a few kills in the back half of this. His Ezreal has been untouchable. He is so good mechanically on that champion. If I'm DK, I have to take him off of that. You cannot allow him to have Ezreal. Just draft it for Aiming. Aiming plays a really good Ezreal as well. We'll talk about it. Kaisa was great here, but, you know, you just can't let Light have this. He's too safe, and he's too consistent on this champ. Tarzan was much, much better when he was off the Nocturne. Again, back on the comfort, kind of like I talked about at the end of game 1. Just get him onto something that he knows how to path on in the early and in the mid game, and he can still make a big difference. And Breathe was, again, really good in this one, just like he was in game 1. So overall, just a very complete game for Weibo. Very clinical. You know, at times I thought that they were a little bit too passive in terms of ending the game. They probably could have been a bit more aggressive in terms of putting their foot on the gas, but play it slow and play it steady. Get to the end of the finish line. This is potentially your last game at Worlds, and so you definitely don't want to throw it away. I understand the ideology, but they've made a game number 3, and for DK, this is more of what I expected from DK. This is kind of the DK I expect to see when they go up against good teams, and Weibo is a team that I think is good. They just don't really have the firepower to play from behind, because they're already not very good in the late game, even when they have gold. When they don't have gold, they are just utter disasters, and there were a couple of players on this team that just ran it down. I do want to talk about Aiming first, because I know I'm an Aiming hater. Like, that's something I'm perfectly willing to accept on this channel. That's definitely a reputation I've gained, like, purposefully, I guess, or understandingly. I knew I was going to get that reputation when I talked about him the way that I did, but I can't deny how good he was in this game. He was incredibly good for DK. In a lot of scenarios, he could have been able to win this game on Kai'Sa. I think this is the best game that he's played in a while, like for a long time this year, because he actually did have agency. He actually was like diving onto the backline and trying to be the hero instead of just cleaning up kills like he typically does, or just sitting in a side lane collecting waves for 25 minutes. Like, I think this was a much more active game from him, but he kind of needed that because the rest of this team was miserably bad. I think Moham is the easiest possible choice for dead of the game. This was a horrendous Nautilus game. Like, this is Mickey X earlier on in the tournament levels of not good, and that's not really what you want to see here in a game where you could potentially be trying to secure yourself into the quarterfinals. Moham was a question mark for this team going into this tournament. To me, he's not really lived up to that question mark. I still am frustrated for Kellen that he is sitting on the bench watching this series, but it is what it is. I think Lucid also struggled a lot more here on the Nocturne. The consistency just wasn't nearly as much there. I think Nocturne plus Camille plus Aurora, this big dive, Kai'Sa as well, like this big dive backline comp that you've assembled is great, but clearly these two teams are not all that comfortable playing it. Like, Nocturne just doesn't feel like it's all that, good for either of these two in particular. I would honestly be shocked if either team went for it in game number 3. As strong as Nocturne has been throughout this tournament, and as much as my opinion has changed on him as a champion, I do think that he is still, you don't have to pick him. He's not pick or ban. He's not B1 or else you lose the game. Like, that's not who Nocturne is. He is very situational and he fits one type of comp. You don't have to go to that type of comp. And it feels like teams just kind of see the results of Nocturne and say, well, we got to pick him. We got to figure out if we can get him into the draft somehow. And, if we draft him, we got to go full dive. It just feels very limiting. And I think a lot of teams have really suffered because of that. So, Lucid doesn't feel comfortable on it. Don't make him play it. He has basically exclusively played tanks plus Lee Sin over the course of this year. Just put him on one of those. Kingen was useless on the Camille on top side, never got to the point where he could split push. The Aurora was also never really able to do much, although that kit is still incredibly good and was able to set up for aiming a couple of times. Showmaker had no damage in the back half of this game because he was going into Yone. So for DK, they just got slapped around. They were the worst of these two teams, and if that happens again, they're going to be going home. And I think, honestly, I'm concerned about DK. The game 1 win is great, but they were still so sloppy in that game 1 win, and then they get obliterated here in game 2. They don't have a ton of momentum coming into this third and final game, but all you need to do is win 1. It doesn't matter what happened in the first 2. It doesn't matter how you got here. If you can win this game 3, you're going to be moving on to the quarterfinals, and if you can't, your year is over. So who's going to be moving on and who will be eliminated first here on day number 9? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to take this series 2-1, and they will be moving on to the quarterfinals. They will get the job done. Game number 1 was put behind them, and games 2 and 3, honestly, were pretty good. There were some worries macro-wise in terms of how they were playing out the back half of this game, but I think those worries have been, a lot less for me than other teams at this tournament. I mean, we talk about a lot of teams struggling in the mid-game and struggling to be able to transition in this current meta with these champions that are currently meta. And yes, Weibo struggles with that, but their early games are so dynamic and they get such gigantic leads from their great skirmishes around 8 or 9 minutes into the game that oftentimes they're going in to those mid games with so much leeway that I honestly think this team is starting to become a bit underrated in terms of how people are talking about them. People are going to walk away from this series feeling, I think, worse about Weibo than they deserve to be felt. I don't think this is going to be some sort of game-breaking team in the quarterfinals or in the semifinals or whatever, depending on who they end up drawing. But I do think that this team is more competitive than they are getting credit for online right now, because this was a good series, in my opinion. And for DK, I'm going to be honest, I'm not surprised at all. We talked about after they even went 2-0 at the start of this tournament, how realistic it was for them to still potentially not make it out of the Swiss stage, not make it out of groups, if you will, because it's just really hard to go 2-0 as a team that probably shouldn't be there and then exclusively play good teams the rest of the way and then, make quarterfinals. It's a difficult road. It's a harder road, honestly, than like what a team like Weibo had to go on, where they were constantly in the middle. They were playing good teams, but not great teams, and eventually they got to a point where all they had to do was win one game, and unfortunately, DK just wasn't able to get over that hump. This was just a bit of a gameplay gap in terms of how this went down. Like, DK was just the worst of these two teams. That became abundantly clear, and even if they were playing the map slightly better at the back half or in the middle of the game here in game number 3, they had absolutely no gold and absolutely no pressure, and they never were able to threaten winning an actual 5v5 and getting an objective and actually running the game from there. And so it just became impossible for them to actually, grow their game further. Like, they were plateaued, and they had to win something in order to get further, and they just couldn't do it. So, credit to Weibo. They deserve a lot of credit for that. Player of the game for me is actually going to go to Tarzan. I don't know how popular of an opinion this is, but Black Shield was the most valuable ability in the entire game. I don't even think it was really all that close. Morgana completely shut down everything that this Vi wanted to do. Honestly, it made Yone a lot less effective, quite frankly, and I was really impressed with Morgana. This is a champion that I've liked for quite a while. I've talked about being kind of a niche pick in the past. This is something I would be shocked if it's brought out a ton, but it's good enough to be brought out regularly if teams are just going to be picking this hard engage, dive style comps that we're seeing so regularly. Even things like Nocturne, I think, are not particularly great into Morgana. I think generally she actually has a really nice niche in the meta right now. And again, that Black Shield is just so valuable in these team fights. Lucid became, quite frankly, a minion at the end of this game because whoever Lucid ulted just got Black Shielded, and all of a sudden the Vi is entirely useless most of the time. That ended up being Light, who was the damage carry this game, or at least part of the damage carry this game. But Tarzan just looking really good on this, pocket pick Morgana, being able to pull this out towards the back half of this tournament in a winner go home game. It's definitely a surprise. I don't think DK was prepping for it, and obviously they weren't drafting for it, and they really got bit by it. So Tarzan's gonna get my player of the game, but player of the series, maybe controversially, I'm gonna give it to Crisp. I thought he was excellent in games 2 and 3. Game 2, we already talked about those 3-4-man Alistair knockups that he was so consistently getting, just finding these engage angles. But here in game number 3 on the Braum, I mean, he was exceptionally good. I remember that the big fight in the mid lane at the start of the game, around 6 or 7 minutes, Crisp ends up flashing in to get the shield up onto Xiaohu to let him survive the engage coming in from Lucid and Showmaker. It's just brilliant stuff. It's perfectly played by him. And again, he's a player that doesn't get nearly enough credit for how well he plays, and I want to give him that credit. I thought he was the best player on Weibo across their 2 wins in this series, and that's why he's getting player of the series for me. He certainly was the better support in this series, which we will talk about in just a moment. Breathe was awesome here in game number 3. He was able to clean up a ton, and honestly, Breathe was pretty exceptional in this series. Kind of gapped King, and King had a really rough tournament. Again, we'll talk about DK in just a second, but Breathe had probably his best series of the tournament here against DK. Great time for that to happen. Xiaohu was good, super greedy, super aggressive in this game, but it ended up working out, and Light is just so consistent. You can't give him Ezreal. Truly, I think I'm at the point now where if I'm looking at Weibo, it's one of the first things that I feel like I have to ban is the Ezreal away, or I have to take it away, because Light is just so consistent on this champion. It's not even that he breaks every single game and that he's dominating and carrying. It's that you can't punish him. He's so good positioning-wise, and he's so comfortable on the champion in early laning phases or in lane swaps or whatever, that you're giving one of the more consistent AD carries in the world the most comfortable pick that they could possibly have. It's not an ideal scenario. I think at some point teams are just going to have to start taking this thing away from him because he's just too good on Ezreal right now. So credit to Weibo. They understood their win conditions. I think they had a great draft here, even if I think it's crazy that they bet their entire season on being able to beat Yone. I think that is an insane choice. I tweeted about that right after draft. I was like, bold choice for Weibo to bet their entire season on Yone losing. But it is what it is. It ended up working out. They had the counter pick in Morgana, and they're going to be moving on to the quarterfinals. And then for DK, I hate to say it, but this is expected in terms of the talent level of this team. They were my lowest ranked Eastern team coming into the tournament. Technically, that's not true. I think LNG was technically ranked below them in my power rankings, but that was before we knew Scout was actually going to be playing. With Scout playing, DK was clearly the worst Eastern team at this tournament, and I think they performed like that. This is really not a surprise to me. Again, I picked Weibo in this series, and the fact that the execution was kind of the difference in this series is not shocking to me either. This team is not very good at winning team fights, and I think we ended up seeing that. Dud of the game is going to go to Moham. I mean, this was a miserably bad series from him. I'm not going to say he solo lost it, because Lucid was horrible down the stretch. I thought Kingen was really bad in this series, but Moham was just atrocious. This was one of the worst support performances we've seen across this entire tournament. The Rel just wasn't it, and that's his signature champion. I mean, it just didn't feel like he was ever finding any sort of engage angle. It didn't feel like he was connected with the team. I don't know if it's nerves. I don't know what it is. The Nautilus game was probably worse in game number 2, but this one was still pretty bad. Lucid was, like I said, a complete caster minion by the end of the game, because Tarzan Black Shield just completely shuts down everything that Vi wants to do. This is as hard counter as a hard counter gets, and Lucid can't do anything about it. The only reason he's not getting dud of the game is because I don't think it was his fault. Moham was just as bad, and I think he had opportunities to do things. Lucid was like horrible, but at least he was countered in draft. Like, at least it wasn't just, oh, he played awful, although he did make some really bad decisions in the back half of that game. Whatever that flank angle was on Light at the end of the game where he just gets insta-blown up, I have no clue what the hell he was thinking. That was disaster. But Kingen, not very good this entire tournament, certainly not good in this series. Breathe completely gapped him on the top side. You know, I like Kingen, I think he's fine, but this is the kind of difference between being a good top laner and being a great top laner, or at least having great top laner upside. Kingen is just not a great top laner. He's not really the kind of player that can step up in these big moments, and for as good as Showmaker is, he couldn't carry when the team needed him the most. I mean, he got the strongest champ in the game, and he ended up losing. It's not entirely his fault. I'm not blaming him, but you know, it is what it is. DK's season is now over. Again, not entirely surprising, but again, congratulations to Weibo. They're going to be moving on now to the quarterfinals. There are a lot of teams that they could draw that I think they would actually beat. So definitely going to be interesting to see what happens, but excited to see that this team didn't actually flame out and underperform at Worlds. But now moving on to our second series of the day, our middle series, and this was the series of the day on the broadcast, and I think for a lot of people, arguably the two best teams sitting at 2-2 facing off against each other. It means one of them is going to miss the quarterfinals. We will see who it will be. It's the number 1 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports, taking on the number 1 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming. This is obviously a completely brutal draw for G2, a team that very much expected themselves to be able to get out of the Swiss stage, not only going into the tournament, obviously, but even with how they've played so far at the tournament. They've been able to compete and really hang in there with some really tough teams throughout this entire run, throughout the entire Swiss stage, and I think for them, being able to, you know, get into that top 8 is kind of the bare minimum from what their expectations are, especially because they've said multiple times that, hey, we've spent 2 full years practicing and training together. We should be competing to win Worlds if we, you know, if that's even possible for us. Like, if that was something that could happen to a team from Europe, like, this is kind of the team that needs to be able to do it. And now they're sitting here and they have to go over the LPL champions in order to just make top 8. It's a brutal draw, but there are some things to look for in terms of G2. They've had a very clear defined playstyle over the course of this tournament, arguably the clearest of any team near the top of the standings. They have very much invested into Nocturne, and that's really been kind of everything that they've wanted to play around. When it is up, when it is available, they are going to pick it. Like, you basically can guarantee that that's all they've played basically over the course of this tournament so far. That was their big thing against T1 in the previous series. It didn't necessarily work out, but it wasn't a problem either. I understand why. It's such an easy to execute wombo that if you've really invested a lot of time into it and you feel very comfortable playing it, it gives you the tools as a team to be able to execute really well in the mid to late game, so long as you put yourself in that position. The problem is, it is pretty predictable. I think teams are going to start picking up on the fact that Nocturne has become kind of the priority pick for G2, and perhaps some of the things that have become very valuable for G2 over the course of the year are actually let through because of it. Potentially things like, you know, Kalista or Draven for Hansama. We could be seeing, you know, like a Braum or a Poppy for Mickey X, like those more comfort picks, even, you know, like a Yone for Caps if they really feel like they need to ban out like Nocturne or pieces of that. That could potentially be a positive, but at the same time, I'm sure teams have practiced a lot against Nocturne over the course of this tournament and the scrim cycle, so, you know, it's a positive and a negative. But G2 definitely has a defined playstyle, and I think that that is certainly something that we're going to continue to monitor. I think when you're looking at positives, I mean, Caps is the positive. He is really the one that you have to look at and hope and pray that he can be as good as Knight. In a series like this, it's a really tall task, but that's going to have to be the win condition for G2. And then for BLG on the other side, they're going to be sticking with Shun. That's kind of the big, you know, newsworthy grab here. I think this is totally fine. The last time these two teams played, Shun obliterated Yike. Like, it wasn't a particularly close jungle matchup. Shun actually has gotten the better of Yike every time they've played, and so I understand why they might want to go in this direction. Again, what I've said about Shun is he's likely going to help you beat better teams than what, you know, a player like Wei will. I think his upside is higher, but his floor is so much lower that it's very risky to put him in a, you know, series like this where your season's on the line. I think generally speaking, like, you know, Shun's gonna struggle a bit more than Wei would against teams that are worse than them, and that's where the concern comes in, is Yike has sometimes been able to get advantages against players that he shouldn't, purely because the enemy just kind of takes him for granted, and so we'll see what happens here with Shun. I think he's gonna be fine. Again, I'm a big Shun fan. I think he's very underrated right now. I think people are just, like, dying on the Wei hill, and I think generally both of them are world-class, and so it's just kind of an embarrassment of riches for BLG, but every other lane you're looking at and you're like, yikes, this is not good for G2, because Elk and On, like, On has certainly struggled at times at this tournament, but so is Mickey, and Elk is incredible. In my opinion, the best AD carry in the world. Hans is known to not necessarily perform super well in these high-pressure scenarios. You've got Knight in the mid lane, as good as Caps is. Knight just might be the best mid laner in the world. Like, him and Chovy are 1A, 1B, I think, for a lot of people, me included. And so, to see him here, like, that's a really bad neutralizer for Caps. And then top lane, like, Bin has obliterated Broken Blade in the past, and generally speaking, Bin is on fire right now. He's always a player who plays better internationally and at Worlds than he does domestically, and he was already phenomenal domestically. It's just, you know, it's not a great matchup for G2. It's a really tough draw, but again, their clear playstyle could potentially be a huge advantage, and Shun is a wild card. Like, he could potentially run it down. You just never really know when it comes to him individually as a player, so we'll have to see what ends up happening, but of course, as you guys know, the only way to figure that out is to go game by game, so let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 1. They are going to go up in this series 1-0, and this was a stomp. I know it doesn't necessarily look like it in terms of the stats that are on the screen. G2 did a good job in the back half of the game of delaying Bilibili being able to close this out as quickly as maybe they would have wanted, but BLG got so much pressure in the early game off of some fantastic jungle pathing from Shun, and all of a sudden the game is just over. There's really no way to actually salvage this if you're G2. Again, they did a good job delaying, but even in fights where G2 was playing really well and focusing priority targets, BLG was playing even better. They played so many of these 5v5s perfectly. They were more than willing to sacrifice Elk, which G2 was very happily trying to take for a majority of these fights, and then would go on to just obliterate the 4v5 because G2 had blown every single cooldown trying to get the Kai'Sa. It's a very interesting strategy, but very much the correct way to play out the back half of this game if G2 is going to be so laser focused on the AD carry. I think BLG just looked very clinical and clean here. This is the team we saw domestically. This is who we thought we were getting at this tournament. This looked like one of the best teams in the world in terms of execution, because again, G2 wasn't miserable in this game. BLG was just better. Shun's going to get player of the game. I mean, there's really no contest for this for me. He was everywhere in the early game. You almost never see a Skarner be this active early on. I'm a little bit lower on Skarner. I would say a moderate amount lower on Skarner, as I've talked about a lot on this channel. I just think that he can sometimes be a little bit more useless in the late game because of his lack of like consistent engage tools. He can sometimes just get bursted down before fights start, but man, if you're going to utilize him as an early gank threat, like a Lee Sin style champion, yeah, go ahead, man. That's ridiculous. Shun's pathing was insane. He was able to generate so many leads for basically everybody on the team, specifically Elk in the early game, but Knight really got rolling because of the Skarner as well. And then all of a sudden you're looking at like a 10-minute game state where BLG has complete map control and every bit of tempo purely because of how well the Skarner ended up playing. This is how you take advantage of something like Nocturne, and I'm sure BLG has practiced a lot against Nocturne, but like Nocturne can't really compete with like these pre-6 junglers because it's just really hard for him to actually skirmish and like fight those out. Like, he has damage, he just has trouble getting in, and so if you are quicker and if you're a little bit more adept at playing the map, like that could be a huge issue going into things like Skarner. So credit to Shun, he really took advantage of that weakness from Noc and really dominated this game. If you wanted confirmation bias that like Shun is still a world-class player that can gap world-class teams, this was absolutely it. Like, don't underestimate him just because he's not Wei, just because he's a different player. Like, this guy's still absolutely world-class. Knight was the kind of damage carry, I would say, throughout the back half of this game, was able to pick up a lot of, you know, kills in those later fights, being set up a lot of the times by On and Bin, doing a really good job of separating G2 again. You saw a lot of this dive onto Kai'Sa's strategy just like go through. You saw a lot of Nocturne just diving onto the backline, Gnar diving onto the backline, just hoping and praying that they can kill the Kai'Sa and then seeing what happens for the rest of the fight. Unfortunately, that left so much space for things like Jax and Alistar to get onto Misfortune, or to get on specifically Orianna, who was really the target in a lot of these fights for BLG, and that really made it a lot easier for Knight to end up playing the back half of this game, so credit to them. Again, Bin and On were great. Elk was the only player that I feel like didn't get a chance to shine, and it's not even really his fault. He had to sacrifice his life in every single team fight in order for BLG to win it. It is what it is. Sometimes that's your role as an AD carry, is to take every ultimate on the enemy team and die so that your team can win the 4v4 or whatever they pick up on the rest of the end. Like, I understand it just sucks for Elk because he didn't really get a chance to do anything this game, but overall for BLG, this is clean, coordinated, and calculated. This was a really good game. I think this is exactly how you want to start off a series like this, but for G2 on the other side, not really what you're looking for. I think this is very demoralizing because I actually do think that they had some good strategies and good ideas in this game, especially in the end game, like where they were trying to team fight and delay BLG being able to end the game. I think they had a lot of good ideas in the back half of trying to target down the Kai'Sa and make, try to create these 4v4 fights that you could potentially win, but the problem was they were just way too far behind. They were like 6 or 7k gold down. Like, this wasn't some tiny deficit. They were just so wallet gapped that there was basically no way for them to play out fights, and it made it impossible for them to do anything. But the reason it's so demoralizing is, like, you actually gave it a good shot, and you were so trounced in the early game, you got so outpathed and outplayed early on, which is G2's weakness, that there was just no way to win, and that's not good. Like, if G2 is playing their style and they're getting crushed, that's really bad. Like, it's not a good thing to see. And so certainly something that they're going to have to hopefully adapt to in game number 2. But Mickey X is going to get my dud of the game. When things are going bad for G2, Mickey looks like an absolute moron. It's just kind of what you live with it, right? Like, Mickey had some engages this game that were horrendously bad, but you just, like, that's how it goes when you're playing with Mickey X and your team is down 6k gold. He's going to try to make the miracle play, and a lot of times he's going to give up his life for it. Sometimes it works, and most of the time it doesn't, but at least he's trying something. I have to give him dud of the game. No, I can't possibly give it to anybody else. Hansama's positioning was really bad this game. Some of the ultimates were effective. That's why he's not getting it. I think I would have considered him outside of that, but his positioning on the Misfortune was way too far forward, way too aggressive. Clearly was just not prepared for the amount of damage that BLG was going to be able to put out. He died first in a lot of fights, which is really unacceptable. And then Yike and Caps just couldn't really play the game. Like, this combo just didn't end up working out. Like, again, you were able to find these rare picks onto Elk, mostly because of Broken Blade on the top side, but they just didn't do anything. Like, the shockwaves were good. They were able to, pick up 3 or 4 members in a shockwave. You were doing no damage, though, and it's not like you were able to follow up with any of it. It just felt entirely useless. They were just wallet gap. There's really nothing else to say. They got so far behind in the early game, there was no winning for them. So, overall, you gotta change something up. Like, for G2, I get that this is comfort, and I get that their style is trying to win these late game team fights, even if they struggle early. That just doesn't work against the best teams in the world. The best teams in the world aren't going to get a 1 or a 2k gold lead like Fnatic would domestically. They're going to get a 5k gold lead, and you aren't going to be able to just outplay them in those fights like that. And so we're really going to need to see G2 step on the gas, or else their season is going to be over here in Swiss. But for BLG, again, this is what we wanted to see. This is the team we thought we were going to get going into this tournament. This is how they played domestically, and I think Shun coming in has kind of reignited that. So I kind of hope to see it again in game number 2. I hope to see BLG, if they are going to move on, looking as good as possible so that we can see that tournament contender that we were hoping we would get. But is that going to stay the case, or is G2 going to be able to answer and push us to yet another game 3? Well, the winner of game number 2 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece. And for the second time already today, we are going to a game number 3. I did not think G2 stood a chance in game 2 after how that game 1 went. It felt like they played exactly the way that they wanted to in that game, and they still couldn't overcome BLG, who was just more clinical than them. But who would have thought that going back to a style that they played a ton domestically, playing for side lanes, things like Yasuo on the top side, things like Silas for Caps, who would have thought that that would open up G2 so much? It didn't feel like they were going to make an adaptation like this, but I think this is the exact kind of draft that they needed. We'll see if they can get away with it in game number 3, but, at least for game 2, they were able to pick up a gigantic win off of it. For BLG, on the other side, they just didn't really have an answer. They drafted this, I guess, comfort comp, but really this early game-focused comp. You've got things like Xinjiao plus Nico that really want to try to get early leads and want to try to snowball the game out of control, and I think that you put yourself on a bit of a timer. I like the anti-dive, that you drafted with Xayah, with Renata, things like that can self-peel and really keep themselves safe and not really allow things like Yasuo or Rakan or Skarner or whatever to kind of break you up. But if you don't have any gold, it doesn't matter how long you survive. You can't really ever fight back, and that ended up being a huge issue for BLG in this game, who just got out-tempoed. The moment that these fights started breaking down around 12 minutes, they really had no answer to get themselves back into the game. So let's talk about it. Player of the game, at least for me, is going to go to Broken Blade on this Yasuo. He drew so much pressure from BLG on the top side of the map, and he was basically unkillable throughout a majority of the game. He is so good at this champion. Honestly, if I'm G2, I'm just sticking with this if they're allowing it the rest of the series, because it really is his best champion. Like, it's always been his best champion. Even going back to his time in Turkey when he was playing there back in 2019 or whatever, like, he was a Yasuo player. And so it's really cool to see in a meta where a lot of these melee, almost like bruiser assassins have gotten buffed, things like the Yone. They're so strong right now because of the rune changes that Yasuo is back in meta, very much playable, and Broken Blade can really, take advantage of that on the top side. Of course, having that matchup into Gnar is definitely a positive. I doubt that BLG is going to blind pick the Gnar again here in game number 3, but definitely a very good punish from Broken Blade, and the tempo he was able to generate, to me, was the most valuable piece that G2 had. But if you want to give this to Caps in the other side lane, absolutely do that. I think he played excellently after the early game. This laning laning phase was very rough, as is expected into Nico, but the Sylas eventually started to get online and started to be able to side lane super efficiently, and by that point there was basically nobody that could stop the Yasuo and the Sylas in side lanes at the same time. You're able to pick apart BLG and completely pull apart the map, and that's what G2 did so successfully. Caps is one of the best side laners at this entire tournament, full stop, and Broken Blade's really high up there as well, and so getting back to that style I think was very comfortable. You also saw some great ultimates out of Yike on the Skarner, specifically that one at the Baron fight where he's able to grab, 2-3 people over the wall and just immediately end it. Really great stuff from him. We were concerned about him after game number 1 because Shun has kind of had his number over the course of their brief histories playing against each other, so it's nice to see Yike can actually generate a ton of pressure. Skarner has looked great in this series for both teams. We'll see if that ends up getting banned by whoever, somebody in game number 3. Hans and Mickey looked a lot more comfortable. Hans was actually really good this game, doing a ton of damage on the Ezreal. He was rich as hell throughout a lot of the mid game here. He was the first one to really get online, and they were very comfortable playing around 3v3s and 4v4s with the Ezreal as the primary. And Mickey, while he still was overextended, when they have leads, it's very acceptable, and it actually can create a ton of positives. So for G2, just a really important game number 2 to keep their season alive, but for Bilibili, just too risky of a draft, in my opinion. Xin Zhao plus Nico might be comfort for these players, specifically the Xin for Shun, but I just don't think it's good enough right now to be able to justify, trying to get to quarterfinals with it. I think you need to simplify your draft. You got counterpicked really hard after blind picking Gnar in the top side. You might think that that's a pretty safe blind, but if, Broken Blade is going to pick things like the Yasuo, you really don't have a way to answer that in the late game if Gnar is going to be your choice, and Bin really struggled this game, continued to try to find 1v1s throughout the game, even when he was super far behind that one with Caps down in the bot lane, where, yes, Bin completely outplayed him. Caps missed basically every single E. He was never in danger of losing that. Like, Caps was never in danger of losing, even though he missed every single ability. It was really not a good one for Bin, just not a good look in my opinion. Pretty bad game from him, but Shun is going to get my dud of the game for just being basically useless on this Xin Zhao. If you're going to pull out Xin, you have to dominate early. That's really what the champion is designed to do, is skirmish and fight all the time in the early game, and that's kind of what your comp wants to do with the Nico. Even the Xayah can really function in that role as well. And just didn't feel like you pressed the gas enough. Once G2 started winning fights around the 8-10 minute mark, like, Xin Zhao was completely useless. So Shin's completely useless. There's no way for him to be able to keep that tempo and stay in the game. And so overall, I just think they got exposed a little bit there. I think On also, while he looked good at certain moments on the Renata, like the ultimate was basically useless and he got caught out being too far forward a couple of times. Knight was doing negative damage on the Nico in the back half of the game. You watch those ultimates land and you didn't see the health bars move at all. It's really a bad sign. I know Nico doesn't do a ton of damage later on in games, but it just goes to show how far behind BLG ended up getting, and G2 have really established themselves. If they can play their style, we know they can beat BLG on their style. They just have to stick to it. We'll see if they try to over-tinker or if they are smart enough to understand that sticking to their guns might be the best option, but BLG now has a pretty good read on what G2 might want to do, and this is a weird draft. If they draft a little bit more standard, something that can play a little bit more towards what G2 is good at, perhaps they might even be able to beat them on that, but it all comes down to this here in game number 3. Winner moves on to quarterfinals. The loser is out of the tournament. Is the number 1 seed from the LEC going to go out, or is the number 1 seed from the LPL going to go out in Swiss stage? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to take this series 2-1. And despite the pause at the end of this game, they are going to quickly get themselves into the quarterfinals. This is obviously not an upset. This is not a shocking outcome. BLG going out in quarters would have been before quarters would have been an absolute disaster. Even going out in quarters is probably a disaster for this team because of the expectations that they have. This has been the best team in the second best region in the world. They made MSI finals. They have run through the LPL, and luckily for them, they're not going to collapse at the finish line of the Swiss stage, but unfortunately, that comes at the expense of the last European team here at Worlds in G2 Esports. They are done. They will not be making the quarterfinals for the second year in a row, and I know that has to feel incredibly disappointing for them, but for the second year in a row, they run into BLG in the final day of Swiss stage and just can't overcome it. It's really unfortunate in terms of how the draw ends up turning out, but this is a team that talked about wanting to win Worlds. Like I said at the beginning of this, they had been, this team has been together for 2 years. They've been playing together for 2 full years, and unfortunately not being able to make it out of Swiss stage either time it's unfortunate. Like, there's no other word that I can use, especially after they probably had the most dominant 2-year stretch domestically in LEC history. It's really, really a shame, but we will talk about it a bit later. Let's talk about the game itself. There is a lot to talk about in terms of this draft. I think G2 obviously going both Ryze and Taric is definitely very intriguing. I think Kalista Taric is still very playable. Taric is very scary to have to play into, especially if you're gonna like lane swap and things like that. He can just blow up a lot of these quick fights, but he really is a, play from ahead type of champion. It's why he's so good with someone like Kalista, because Kalista can generally efficiently generate leads in the early game, and so you feel good with Taric because you want to be the ones engaging. You want to use the ultimate proactively instead of reactively, because it's hard to play Taric when you have no gold. And so that's going to be something we talk about a bit later. But then you also have the Ryze here. Another thing that can split push for Caps in side lanes. This is like the peak European mid laner. Like, this is what I think of when I think of an LEC pick, is Ryze. And so to see Caps pull it out here in a pretty pivotal moment, it's certainly interesting. I don't like this draft all that much from G2 in like the grand scheme of things. I think Xin Zhao is not really an R1 that I would be personally willing to go for right now. It's not really been something that we've seen throughout a ton of this tournament, and I think throughout this series, we kind of saw why from both Shun and from Yike. I think generally speaking, Kalista Taric needs to dominate early, and playing into something like Ezreal, especially Elk's Ezreal, is very difficult to end up abusing, and Elk ended up actually up in gold throughout a lot of the mid game, which is a disaster for the Kalista. And then also you gave up Knight Sylas, and I get that he blind picked it, and Ryze is generally pretty good at being able to stop Sylas pushing inside waves. It just wasn't enough. You never really had enough to be able to break through that Sylas and to be able to actually deal the damage you needed to, which was the problem. But Elk is going to get my player of the game. He kind of has to. The way he was able to abuse that final fight, the one that ended up causing the pause, was brilliant. I mean, he played that about as perfectly as you possibly can. Knight played a fight similarly perfectly earlier on. It basically was this, like, it was a 3v4 at the start, but On gets blown up super quickly. It's Knight and it's Bin, and they have to 2v4 essentially, and they pull it off because of Knight's healing. That was excellent, but Elk's play in the mid lane to really seal this game and put the ribbon on the gold lead that they had generated, that is really, I think, what you have to point out. Really what this is for BLG is an expression that mechanically they still are one of, if not the best team in the world. I mean, you don't get these kinds of plays from other regular teams. This is genuinely the only kind of performance that you would see from like BLG. You don't see it from, FlyQuest or whatever. Respect to FlyQuest, they're awesome, but like, I'm sorry, like, Elk was just insane in this game, and I feel very vindicated, very justified for putting him as my number 180 carry at the tournament after a game like this. It's been a little up and down for Elk, I would say, over the course of this tournament. A lot of that is On really struggling to find any sort of consistency, but man, when he is working, like, is there a more mechanically talented ADC in the world? It is really, really, really hard to say. But again, Knight was excellent on the Sylas. This is a pick that he's very well known for. Knight Sylas is pretty legendary, and so I understand why they wanted to go towards it, even though it's blind Sylas, which is almost never a good idea. Skarner has been a massive pick across this series, 3-0 across all 3 games. I'm not saying that that's the only reason that these teams won, but Skarner clearly has a lot of power that I wasn't necessarily giving the champion credit for. Bin was huge in this game, multiple 4 to 5 man Rumble ultimates, because G2 kept clumping up for Ryze ultimate, and so it really was a nice counter, almost accidentally in that sense. Bin was able to do a ton of damage throughout this game, and On obviously with some great engages. Overall, BLG just playing incredibly well. This game was very even for a very long time, and then one horrible Baron call later for G2, and all of a sudden they just push their lead into oblivion. But for G2, it's got to feel horrible to sit there and go, if we don't call for that Baron, do we win the game? Like, I think that's a very valid thing to ask yourself if you're G2, is if we don't make that decision, like, is this game won if we just play it slower and we actually take the 5v5 around that? Do we actually win that? Like, that's certainly a question, and all of a sudden the game becomes a lot more interesting. But they do go to Baron. They do make the call after a one-team fight to just try to rush it, and they get blown up, and they lose Baron, and they lose their entire gold lead, and they have to play from behind at that point, which is unfortunate. But there were things they could do after that I think really could have gotten them back into the game, and they just didn't have the firepower to do so. Caps was never really able to take over the game in the way that you would want with this Ryze on R5, especially as the counter pick to Sylas. I thought Sylas was more relevant in this game. The ultimates were good from Caps, but again, most of the time it was actually setting up for some really good Rumble ultimates on the other side. Even Ezreal was able to take advantage of that quite frequently, so some good and bad when it comes to the Ryze. But dead of the game for me is going to go to Broken Blade in the top lane. As much as I don't think he played horrible, I don't think anybody in this game played horrible. A lot of times just diving without the rest of his team onto, BLG, trying to separate the front and the back lines and just getting bursted down immediately. Like, that lost them the game in that final fight, but there was more than just that final fight. There were just so many different things where I don't think Broken Blade was particularly useful here on the Renekton. It's fine as a blind pick top laner here, but Rumble has shown itself to be quite the menace at this tournament, even for someone in Bin who's barely played Rumble. It's not one of his signature champions. It's certainly not a champion you would associate with his style of play. And so, unfortunately for Broken Blade, just wasn't able to stay useful throughout the entire game, wasting, cooldowns and summoner spells, just not great. I think Hans was really good in that final fight. I don't really know the specifics of the bug, whether or not it actually was something that could have been, prevented, like the Callista Spears. It looks like he just didn't press it in time and they expired after Rumble came out of the Zhonya's. That would be my guess, and League officials seem to agree, but Hans was still, really good outside of that. He was their hope in winning this game, and even Yike was relevant. I just think Xin Zhao as a champion kind of let him down. He actually had a pretty good game, all things considered, in terms of being in the right place at the right time, but G2 just didn't have enough firepower. I think they played really well today. They pushed one of the best teams in the world to their brink, but unfortunately, that is going to be the end of their 2024 season, and I don't really know where they go from here. It's going to be really interesting to watch their offseason, but for BLG, they avoid disaster. They end up making quarterfinals like they always wanted to, and from here on out, it's a blank slate. You're really good in best-of-5s. Like, BLG is one of the best best-of-5 teams in the world. They get better as the series goes along. They've shown that over the course of this year, and so this could be the start of something bigger for BLG, but it really seems like this team has gotten their mojo back. But then moving on to our third and final series of the day, and with all of the consequences that we've had throughout this day so far, with how much has been on the line for regional pride and just for the teams involved, it feels like this one has, just as much and also significantly less stakes in multiple different ways. It's the NA civil war between the number 1 seed from the LCS in FlyQuest and the number 2 seed from the LCS in Team Liquid. Of course, there is a lot on the line because one of these teams will be going home and one of them will be going to the quarterfinals, but especially coming off of a series where it's like the number 1 LPL seed representing the entire region, the final European team at the Europe Worlds representing the entire region, and one of the regions is going to be crushed and sent home. It's like, well, here are 2 NA teams, and if you're an NA fan, one of them's going to advance, guaranteed. It's definitely a bit of a different vibe, but still a lot of intrigue around this. These 2 teams have definitely developed a rivalry over the past couple of years, and it's very much culminated over the course of this year. I think a lot of the yapping that Yappa does in the mid lane has definitely increased a lot of the, interest in these 2 teams going head-to-head, and generally, the finals from Summer was looked at in a very weird way, because it was such a strange ending with the Winions ending up taking that. There is a lot of history between these 2, and I think that means we're going to get a series that's maybe a little bit different from what we're seeing out of a lot of the other games here at Worlds, in the sense that I don't know if this is going to be quite as stock standard Worlds drafts as you would see. I've said a lot over the course of this tournament. I think the West in general was really screwed by actually getting to Europe before everybody else. They got here before Korean teams and Chinese teams. They played more solo queue, they played more champions queue, and they got suckered into picking up a lot of these hype beasts coming in before the tournament, like Syndra, that have really not performed particularly well, and they've kind of refused to drop them, and both of these teams have suffered from that to an extent, but I would argue that Team Liquid probably has the worst read of the meta of anybody in the entire Swiss stage. It just feels like they have never figured out how to draft in this current meta, and, that has been a huge problem for them. On paper, they should be the better of these 2 teams, and what we saw in the previous round against GAM was a bit of good and a bit of bad. Once they got their shit together in games 2 and 3, they obliterated GAM, and they started playing like the dominant TL that we had gotten used to for most of this year, but losing game 1 to GAM, like barely getting past Pain Gaming with a couple of really close games, losing leads to both LNG and Weibo Gaming, there is so much up and down turbulence for Team Liquid at this tournament. It's really hard to get a read of whether or not they're actually good at the game right now, but for Fly, it's kind of the opposite. We came into this tournament, I think, with low expectations for this team, or at least I did. I didn't have a ton of expectations for them to be even near this 2-2 spot, and yet here they sit, and they've actually done it by competing relatively well with very good teams. People are going to point out the Hanwha Life series, but they've been competitive in basically every matchup that they have played across this tournament, and they've only beaten bad teams as well. That's certainly something to consider in terms of just the way things have worked out. They've only beaten minor region teams, but, they still got here. Like, they still were able to make it 2-2-2, and again, pushing Hanwha Life has shown that they're at the very least in okay form, but they've really thrived off of weird out-of-meta picks, and so I don't really know what to expect from these games is essentially what I'm leading into this. I think basically anything could happen. If Team Liquid is on point, and if their meta read is even remotely competent, then I think they probably win this, but FlyQuest has been better at this tournament, mostly because they've been better at adapting to this new meta and pulling out surprise pocket picks. If they can do that here, then they're definitely going to be the favorites. So it's interesting in that regard, but certainly a lot of questions left to be answered. It's our final series of the Swiss stage, and we're going to go game by game. So let's kick it off, starting with game number 1. Let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was FlyQuest. They are going to pick up the first game of the series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this was a very weird game to try and figure out, to try and analyze, because there was so much going on. I think the draft was very strange. I mean, not to mention, like, the first thing to mention, I guess, in terms of this draft, sorry, I'm discombobulated because this game is very weird, but the first thing to mention, Yone and Aurora go completely unpicked or unbanned throughout this entire draft process. That is got to be the first time in the main stage of Worlds that has happened. Feels like those two champions have been widely agreed upon to be so overpowered that you can't possibly give them over. Once they both went through ban, I was like, okay, it's guaranteed that, you know, FlyQuest is probably going to pick up the Yone, force Team Liquid onto Aurora, which they've really struggled on at this tournament. You know, it makes a lot of sense. But Fly clearly doesn't play the Yone because they don't pick it. Instead, they go for what? Skarner first pick, which I think is fine. Team Liquid, though, now has the chance to pick both Yone and Aurora. You can put Aurora in the top lane for impact, and while he's not been great on it, it's certainly strong enough for you to be able to create something, and hopefully APA can play Yone, but no, neither of them want to play those, and so they just ignore them as well. They draft Xin Zhao Jax, and now we're sitting at a whole draft phase where there's no Yone, no Aurora, and it just goes to show, like the point I was making, where these teams just don't really seem to be on the same page as a lot of the other teams at the tournament right now, or they just don't really seem to have practiced the things we all knew were going to be incredibly broken. But Team Liquid's draft is much worse. I think FlyQuest ended up rounding out a very complete draft here. I think Ori, Skarner, Cassante as a top side's really easy to execute and really gives you a lot of options both early and late, but come on, man. Xin Zhao Syndra, like, you had to know that this was going to be a problem. You had to know that you were going to lack any sort of consistent damage in the early and in the mid games. Xin Zhao wants to skirmish all the time, and yet you have nobody on this team who actually can skirmish. Yan was super fed, which we will get into, and yet they couldn't make anything of it. So we'll get into the specifics of the game now, but I did want to talk quite a bit about draft before we got into it, because I do think there is a lot to talk about when it comes to how this draft ended up playing out. But really, this game can be divided into two sections. The first half, which is all about Yan and Core JJ just obliterating the 2v2 down on the bot side. Yan was up like 2k gold by himself, just alone. In the 2v2, I continue to die on the hill that he is the best laner, full stop, in the West, that there is nobody that can compete with him, nobody in any other role, in the EU, in North America, wherever, right? Like, he is just so good at individually laning and getting big leads that you can put him on basically anything and he's going to be able to do that. Masu and Busio were farmed this game in the 2v2, but he's on Jhin and he can't really do anything down the stretch of a game like this. So what happens in the back half? Well, Impact completely falls off after generating a nice early lead in a counter matchup that Bwipo opted himself into. More on that later. Impact completely falls off. Umti and APA do basically nothing throughout the entirety of this game, and now all of a sudden Quad is mega fed, and Bwipo is unkillable on the Cassante, and Yan has all the gold, but he's Jhin, and they have a Cassante Skarner on the other side that you're never going to be able to break through. It's just tragic. They lost in draft. There was no way to salvage this game for Team Liquid, and it's frustrating because this has happened multiple times at this tournament. Fnatic has really frustrated me a lot as well with their draft reads, or frustrated me now that they're out of the tournament, but Team Liquid is the worst offender of just not understanding how this meta works and not really being able to adapt. Like, it doesn't even feel like they're watching any of the other games and it's costing them. So, you know, I guess that's really it, right? Like, that's the takeaway from this, is they have to start leveling up their drafts or else they're just going to be in positions where they can't win the game. Player of the game is really up for debate. I'm going to give it to Quad because he was just obliterating people in terms of his damage in the back half. I don't think his ultimates were always on point. I don't think he was always in the right place or anything, but this was certainly a good enough game for him to really stand out, and the mid gap in this game was absolutely ginormous. APA could not even remotely compete with Quad in the late game. We'll talk about APA, who had a miserable game, but Bwipo was also crazy important on the Cassante. Again, when you have this big tank and Jhin is the fed member of the other team, there's just really no way for Jhin to ever be able to take over in any of these fights, and Bwipo was the reason for that. Inspired was pretty good. I think he could have been more active in the early game, but, you know, it's Xin Zhao, you're Skarner, you have an Orianna, just scale it out. I understand. The Lulu's really interesting. I think this is underplayed at the meta. I've talked about it a lot. Enchanters in general are just underplayed, but that's because supports just don't like playing Enchanters. They want to play these fun engagers that they can be more aggressive on, but Lulu's in a good spot. Didn't really show it off in this game because bot lane was a disaster for Fly, but they ended up rebounding. It wasn't too bad for them. They were just down a ton of gold. Overall, this was a pretty clean game from Fly, understanding that as long as they can get to 15 minutes and Jhin is the only member fed, there's really no way that they can lose this, but they really should not have been in this game if Team Liquid had a competent draft, and that's really what it comes down to. Dud of the game is going to go to APA in terms of his performances. He was horrible, like didn't contribute to a single kill this entire game. No kill, no assist, no nothing, just died over and over again, was not really all that strong in lane. Syndra continues to be a pick that I will die on the hill of being horrible. Maybe not horrible. Like, it's playable. You can win with Syndra, but golly, man, Team Liquid is just obsessed with picking mid laners that I do not like. APA's meta read in particular seems awful. I feel like he is just not like, he just doesn't get it right now. And it is what it is. I wish he would watch a lot of the other games at this tournament, but it doesn't seem like they want to do that. They put Impact back on Jax. I get he has a skin for this champion, but he hasn't been good at it the entire tournament. And in fact, he's actually been really bad at it in the late game, just grouping all the time, losing gold, and basically forfeiting any advantages he's able to generate in lane. It's not good. Like, was completely out jungled on the Xin Zhao, a pick that continues to look very underwhelming, especially into Skarner. I don't know what happened in scrims yesterday, but now everybody's picking Xin Zhao. It's just strange, man. There's nothing else left to say. Tom Kench on R5, like, I don't even hate that pick. I think it can generally work, especially against Ashe, but I don't know, man. Team Liquid needs to figure something out, because if they continue to draft and play like this, they're not going to stand a chance against FlyQuest, who's not perfect. They're not making perfect plays. Their early games are still really bad, but it doesn't matter because their late games are really good, or at least solid enough to be able to come back from deficits, and their meta read and drafts are so much better than Team Liquid's. I think that's going to determine whether or not TL even has a chance in this series. So big game 2 here. Of course, Fly winning it has the chance to move on, but TL has the chance to push us to a game 3 and to the maximum amount of games here, 9, if they are able to pick up the victory. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 2. They are going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and we are going to our 3rd consecutive game number 3. It's a 9-game day here on the final day of Swiss. It is going the distance once again, and I guess we couldn't have asked for anything more. This certainly is best case scenario if you were looking for competitiveness, because we are really getting every single team showing up at least once here today, and that's what we saw from Team Liquid in this game too. I spent basically all of my time analyzing game number 1, talking about how frustrated I was with Team Liquid's meta read and how angry I was that they failed to adapt to a lot of the tournament. I think that very much still stands here. I think they got completely outdrafted once again in this game. I just don't think it matters. Their early game is so much better than FlyQuest, and this is what I was talking about. Team Liquid as a team is better than Fly. I think we've seen that basically every single time that these two teams have played over the course of this year, maybe with the exception of like game number 2, or not game 2, game 1 in the finals of Summer. I think that's really the only game that I can be like, TL just got completely outplayed. Like, every other time, TL has put themselves in such a deficit at the start of the game that it's really hard to kind of attribute anything else, even in their final loss in game number 4 to Fly in the finals. Like, they lost to minions. Like, the game was super close. They probably should have ended. They just didn't do their due diligence. And so you're looking at a team that really should just be better than FlyQuest, mechanically speaking. And in this game, they definitely were, but they just keep giving themselves obstacles that they have to overcome for basically no reason. So I'm glad they're starting to get out of their own way. The post-game 1 Spawn speech seems to be completely unbeatable. That's certainly something that we are seeing from this team. And so let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is very easily going to go to Core JJ in the support position. He's been awesome at Worlds. Him and Jan have been exceptionally good, even with APA and Impact and UMT like being, quite frankly, not very good at this tournament so far. It's nice to see that the Team Liquid bot lane is stepping up and being very consistent for this team. Jan's insane. I've gone on and on about him on this channel. I think that he is an absolute menace and a monster. He even dominated in game number 1. He just couldn't do too much on the Jhin because of the way that the two team comps were constructed. But once again, another really good game for the Team Liquid bot lane where they are just straight up better than their opposition. Masu has been really good at this tournament. He's getting mega gapped by Jan right now, and so, you know, you got to give him a lot of credit for that. But Core, as a creator and as a facilitator and as a protector in this game, as somebody that's keeping Jan alive and making sure he has an easier time playing the game, is just exceptionally good. I know it sometimes feels like I'm a bit of a Core hater, and I'm certainly not a Core hater. I very much want to acknowledge that he is the best support that the LCS in North America has ever seen, and I do think that that world champion experience is not just like some sort of tagline. He absolutely brings something mentally and to the shot calling department that other teams just don't have, and there's a reason that he is so consistently able to win, even with the talent around him being inexperienced in a lot of cases. However, I just think Jan sometimes gets undersold because of how good Core JJ is. Core is really, really solid, and these are the kinds of games that look incredible. I think Core has been even better at Worlds than he was domestically, which is a really good sign. Hopefully, if he's going to be able to keep this up throughout throughout, the end of this series, game number 3, and then maybe into quarters, that could be a really scary proposition for, a couple of teams in the quarterfinal stage. But him and Jan are just unbelievably good. Jan is like the perfect kiter. I tweeted this out in the middle of the game, but honestly, right now, put on a list every single AD carry in the West from North America or Europe. I'm taking Jan, and it's not even really all that close. He is the best AD carry in the West, and he has really cemented himself as somebody that can compete internationally with basically anybody. I know that this is Masu and Busio when he's played them domestically, but he's not just competing with Masu. He's obliterating FlyQuest bot lane, who has been pretty good, and Jan has been excellent over the course of this tournament. If there is anybody that I think has really solidified their space in the top upper echelon of players over the course of this tournament, it's probably Jan. This guy is legit, and you have to start accepting that. I think this was a much better game from APA, obviously, on the Tristana. Still a champion that I'm like 1 foot in, 1 foot out on. I'm way more out on Tristana than I was at the beginning of the tournament. I do think that her damage is a lot more lackluster than I was giving her credit for, just because she's kind of playable in solo queue right now doesn't mean she's playable on the world stage. But, APA, when you're able to get like 6 or 7 tower plates throughout the game, yeah, when you accelerate that much, it's going to be pretty easy to be able to utilize Trist, and he's obviously very comfortable with the champion. He's shown that in the past. He played this a lot in the summer split. Looked a lot more comfortable in the Nocturne as well, but Impact looked way better on the Rumble. Bwipo was abused this game on the top side, and we'll talk about that in a second. But overall, Team Liquid playing to their style. If this game is over early, that's going to favor Team Liquid. If you pick this draft that decides whether or not the game is going to be in your favor or not early on, then that's going to be a Team Liquid favored thing of these two teams, because that's their strength, is winning early, and FlyQuest does not have that same strength. And unfortunately for Fly, they didn't get the memo because they drafted Vi, Ari, and Kalista, and obviously this is a better draft from a pure compositional perspective. I think that a better team would be able to pilot this to a pretty clean win against Team Liquid, but this is not Fly's strength. This is basically the exact opposite of how Fly likes to play the game. Picks are good for them, but they don't really want something that needs to have a ton of agency in the early and in the mid game. They want to be able to scale up, and they don't really have that option or that opportunity here. Really, you don't have any sort of out if things don't go well for you in the early game. That's kind of the problem with Vi, Ari, especially with something like Kalista down in the bot lane. But dud of the game for me is going to go to Bwipo on the top side. Like we said, just completely abused. He was so far down in gold that at one time I think he had less gold than Core JJ on the other side, which is a disaster. If you're a top laner and you are getting out golded by the support on the enemy team, things are going wrong for you. There's really no way to salvage that. This was just not a good game from Bwipo. The Cassante ended up losing Prio incredibly early. Rumble does relatively well, has always done relatively well into Cassante, and, Bwipo started Bwipoing. He started walking up and dying for no reason. You just kind of have to live with that. That's who he is as a player. But overall, Fly just picked a draft that I don't think they were particularly comfortable with. They didn't get a chance to do the thing they're really good at, which is scale the game into late and try to stay as competitive as possible in the early game, and eventually they just lost. By the 15-minute mark, this game was over. We were just waiting for Team Liquid to close it out. It wasn't close, and so again, this is looking familiar for Team Liquid fans. This is looking like the GAM series. This is looking like exactly what happened there, where they didn't really show up. They had a bad draft in game 1. Their meta read was off, and they figured things out in games 2 and 3 and ended up dominating them and moving on. That's the hope for Team Liquid, is that they can carry that kind of momentum over. But of course, Fly's not going to go down in the same way that GAM did. This team is more talented than that. And really, it's up to anybody. It's up to whether or not Team Liquid can win the early game, in my opinion, who ends up taking this game 3. But the only way to know is to go over it. So with our final game of the Swiss stage, let's get into it. The winner of game number 3 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to take this series 2-1, and they will punch their ticket to the quarterfinals of the World Championships for the first time ever. This org has never been able to make the quarterfinals before. This is the first time that they have finally been able to cross over that threshold, and honestly, I couldn't be more proud of this team and this organization. They are run so well. It obviously starts at the top with the coaching staff that they brought in with Nuke Duck and Mithy and everybody, Arrow, everybody that's a part of this coaching staff has done a phenomenal job. And of course, Papa Smithy being able to kind of be the architect of it all. This guy has found nothing but success at every single organization that he has been at in North America after becoming a general manager, and FlyQuest is certainly no different. He is super into investing into young North American talent, and that's how you get a roster with Masu and Busio and even someone like Quad, who obviously came over from the LCK but spent an entire split in Academy getting getting ready for this moment and the team trusted enough to promote him mid-season. Like, that's how you get a roster like this to really figure things out as the year goes along, not only to win the LCS, but to prove that you're the best team in North America by beating Team Liquid again at Worlds to get yourself into the quarterfinals. This is a phenomenal accomplishment for FlyQuest, the biggest in their organization's history, and you just have to be proud of them. For Team Liquid on the other side, this is obviously a pretty brutal loss. This is basically the opposite of what you would have wanted in this situation. A lot of people were writing off the summer finals because of the way that it happened. The games weren't even all that dominant for Fly in the first place, and TL looked so much better the entire split up until that point. But as we saw at this tournament, they just weren't able to adapt. They go for something crazy, a Hail Mary in game number 3 here with the Kled mid. This has to be one of the first time Kled has ever been mid professionally. I mean, it's definitely the first time at Worlds or any international tournament, but I can't remember a Kled mid game ever. And to pull that out in this pivotal moment, in this clutch scenario, it's a crazy decision, and unfortunately it doesn't work out for them. But you have to give Team Liquid credit. The development and the strides they've made over the course of this year, they're astounding. I did not have this as a Worlds team in January, and they proved me entirely wrong. Even going into spring playoffs, they were like the number 6 seed in spring playoffs, and they weren't just a team that ended up making Worlds from North America. For most of the year, they were the dominant North American team. They performed well at MSI. They were able to take down some really tough opponents throughout the year. The Esports World Cup, they looked really good at. Like, this is not some nothing burger of a team. They really put up a good year, and it's just unfortunate that it has to end. But for Fly, you just have to be excited for them. Player of the game, pretty obviously to me, has got to go to Inspired in the jungle. This is once again an example of Inspired just proving that he is the best jungler in North America. It's not even remotely close. He mega gapped again in a game that really mattered. The Skarner was gigantically important, and quite frankly, Skarner was a huge pick throughout the entire day. This is very against kind of what we've seen from this tournament. Not that Skarner has been bad, just that Skarner's been fine. He's been highly prioritized by a lot of teams, but his success rate really isn't actually that good. It certainly was today. It felt pretty broken when basically anybody picked it up on the final day here. Really interesting to keep a monitor on that, but Inspired is just a menace. I've talked about it for a long time. I've hyped him up on the channel for a long time. I've even had commenters say that I'm overhyping Inspired for a long time, so it's nice to see him not only prove it in the finals where he gaps and becomes finals MVP, but prove it here in their rematch and gets them to the quarterfinals. He is one of the best players in North America, and this guy has won everywhere he's gone, whether it's Rogue, whether it's Evil Geniuses, whether it's FlyQuest right now. He has won everywhere that he has been, and that's not a coincidence. This guy just creates winning cultures because he is that damn good. But player of the series as a whole is going to go to Quad in the mid lane for me, and that is huge for FlyQuest. Again, this player that had this okay career in the LCK, like, he played for DRX for a couple of years and, got me to fall in love with the organization, and then they moved into a different direction, gets brought back by Nongshim after being a streamer for a little bit in Korea, and really doesn't do well in the LCK, gets brought over to play in the NACL and looks amazing in the 1v1s, but still has to grow and develop in terms of playing the map, gets promoted because they wanted somebody that could be a little bit more forceful in terms of the 1v1s in the mid game, and all of a sudden now he can really expand his playstyle. He's gotten a lot better at playing through the rest of his lanes. He's gotten a lot better at being low resource, and now he's such a complete player that he can carry a team or be the captain of a team that's going to quarterfinals at the World Championships. And this guy was on the 10th place LCK team last year. Like, it's just a monstrous achievement for a player that I have to imagine feels amazing at the current moment. This is a great story for him. Weibo pulls out the Galio top, kind of the European classic, in honor of Broken Blade, who fell earlier today. He looked excellent in this game. Galio looked unkillable going into the Rumble, and it really even wasn't that bad against the Kled either. I felt like that would be really bad for the Galio, but it ended up being really good for him the later on in the game it went because he was just unkillable. Masu and Busio played really well. This was easily their best game of the series after kind of getting gapped by Yan and Core in the first two. It's nice to see that they can show up when it really matters. Masu was great in the team fights here at being able to capitalize on the things that Inspired was able to create, but I haven't really talked about the game state. This was a blowout. This game was over at 7 minutes. It just got delayed and delayed until eventually it ended. Like, obviously, it happens. It's kind of very similar to game number 2, just kind of the opposite with FlyQuest being on top, but this was an amazing game for Fly, and even if they don't do anything in the quarterfinals, if they go out 3-0 to a Genji or whatever, like, just making it there in the first place, I feel like is such an accomplishment for this team. But for Liquid, again, I don't want to throw out the entire year just because of a bad tournament, because this really was not a great indicator of how good Team Liquid was over the course of this year, but this was a really bad World Championships, and I think there's a lot of reasons for it. Obviously, the first thing I point to is the meta read, where they just didn't really ever seem to have a good grasp of what they needed to play. The moment that they started drafting good, well-rounded comps, they started winning games, but they just kept having to mess with the formula and try to tinker a little bit too much, and it ended up really costing them. In this case, that was the jungle mid. I mean, Kled just wasn't useful at all. He's not going to get dead of the game because I think was worse individually, but APA definitely deserves dead of the game for pulling out Kled and just completely running it down on it. It's just not the time, in my opinion, for something like this. Like a shocking pick, if it worked, we would have been singing its praises, but it didn't, and so it's open to criticism. It's unfortunately just how it works, but also just got completely gapped by Inspired. To me, that was the bigger difference, is that Inspired was so active in the early game, was so influential on whether or not this game was going to be won or lost pre-8 minutes, and we talked about it. Team Liquid's entire game plan was that they had to win early, and you draft Kled, and you want to play for the middle of the map, you have to snowball, and the moment that Inspired started taking over in the mid lane and turning around that 2v2, and then went bot lane and got a kill on a gank, like, it's over. It's really difficult to play that back for Team Liquid because they're already not very good at playing out the back half of these games, and so it's just unfortunate. Impact had a really bad tournament, but again, that's not even really that much of a surprise. He's not been great at Worlds over the past couple of years. If there is a bright spot, it's Yan. Like, this guy is an absolute monster, and he still was not the problem in this game. Core was fine in this game as well, and he was really great throughout the rest of this tournament, but, there is some building blocks for Liquid. I don't know what their direction is going to look like going into 2025, but it's really hard to look at this as anything other than one of the most successful years they've ever had. I know they've been to Worlds and they've had success in the past. They've gone 3-3 with Doublelift in the past or whatever, but this was a team that genuinely felt like they could compete at the top level. They didn't quite make MSI finals like 2019, but like, this is one of the more successful years in this organization's history, and they did it with a roster that nobody had these kinds of expectations for. But again, congratulations to FlyQuest. They have very much deserved getting into the quarterfinals. I know people are going to laugh at the schedule, but this is a team that took Hanwha Life to the absolute brink, and quite frankly, you can make an argument that if they didn't just completely run it down and throw away game number 1 of that HLE series, that they would have gone to quarters beating HLE 2-0. And so it really is a team that deserves to be there. And again, even if they don't do anything in quarters, even if they get, stomped by somebody, this is still a team that I think has earned everybody's respect over the course of this tournament. All right, but that is going to do it, not only for day number 9 of the Swiss stage here at Worlds, but for the entirety of the Swiss stage here at Worlds. We got our quarterfinals draw, and by proxy, our draw for the rest of the tournament. The bracket is established, and we know who will be on each side. This is certainly an interesting draw. I think in terms of competitiveness, this is one of the better ones we could have gotten. I think all of the teams that ended up getting drawn on different sides are good. We are potentially setting up like Genji and Top Esports in the semifinals, and then HLE and BLG are on the same side, and so top 4 look like, or at least like it'll be 2 of the top 4 on one side, 2 of the top 4 on the other side, which is a good thing, but you've got some wild cards in there. T1 could potentially be a part of that top 4 if they're able to take down Top Esports. I mean, LNG went undefeated in the Swiss stage, even though they had a pretty easy path to get there, and so there are some things to talk about, and we'll go over them now. As you can see, the draw is up on the screen. Weibo Gaming taking on LNG, and then Hanwha Life taking on Bilibili on the top side. Certainly an interesting draw, and then T1 taking on Top Esports, and Genji taking on FlyQuest on the bottom side. Let's quickly preview what these series have to offer, what I think, who I'm predicting to move on, and I'll just generally give like a full bracket thing here. I'm not going to go in and do all of the edits that I would for like a primer video, because this video is already very long, but I do want to give you guys my thoughts and opinions on who I think is going to be winning Worlds and why I think they're going to be winning Worlds. So we'll start with Weibo taking on LNG. To me, this is a really interesting matchup. We saw this obviously in the regional qualifiers to make Worlds, and LNG was able to get that, but that was a really close series, and Weibo honestly looked better for a majority of the year, and so it's hard to pick. LNG's in great form right now, and I think if Scout really pops off and has a good series, LNG is going to win it, but Weibo is probably a more well-rounded team from a roster perspective. I haven't loved how Weibo's played at this tournament, but you never really know when a team like that is going to be able to turn their fortunes around, especially the org, Weibo Gaming, who is known for just randomly being really good at times, especially against good opponents. And so I think it's pretty realistic to expect Weibo to have a chance to win this series, but at least until I can see it, LNG is going to be favorited. Although I do think this is closer to a 50-50 than, a lot of the other analysts probably will. I think a lot of people are going to favor LNG by a lot. I certainly think Weibo has more of a shot in this than people are going to give them credit for. The most intriguing of the round 1 matchups, the quarterfinal matchups, Hanwha Life taking on Bilibili Gaming. These were number 2 and number 3 in my power rankings coming into this tournament. BLG obviously has not necessarily played up to that so far at this tournament. They've had their problems, and Hanwha Life has quite frankly looked excellent outside of, that one series against FlyQuest where they were randomly kind of throwing games away, but this is a really, really big series for both of them. One of these teams is not going to make top 4, and I think that's going to be considered a big disappointment. I have to imagine that HLE in their current form is going to be better. That's going to be my prediction. I think BLG just doesn't have a great understanding of how this meta goes, but we're getting Zeka versus Knight in the quarterfinals. We're getting freaking Peanut versus like Shun or Wei. Like Elk versus Viper, like maybe the two best AD carries in the world. This is a crazy matchup. I mean, Dorian versus Bin, this is a crazy matchup for the quarterfinals. I'm super excited to see who comes out on top here, and I'll just spoil it now. Whoever wins this game is going to be heavily favored to beat either Weibo or LNG. I think HLE and Bilibili are the two best teams on the top side of the bracket, and I think whoever ends up winning that series is probably going to be going to the finals. And so that's my prediction. But then on the bottom side of the map, you've got three incredibly good teams and FlyQuest, which we will get to. T1 taking on Top Esports. We already saw this at Worlds. We saw Top Esports beat T1 in a best of 1, but a best of 1 is very different than a best of 5, especially against a team as experienced in practice as T1. They've also leveled up a lot since that series. It feels like they found their comfort zone and gotten back into Worlds form, so I think this is going to be a very interesting one. When you look back at the history of these two teams, Top Esports has not been able to beat T1 outside of that best of 1 across this year. They lost to them in the finals at the Esports World Cup, and they lost to them at MSI as well. So T1's kind of had their number over the course of this year outside of the best of 1. I think it's very realistic to expect T1 to win this series, but it's just hard for me to go against Top Esports, who we've constantly been doubting at this tournament, and they've proven that they are everything we thought they were domestically, in a good way, where they're showing all the good things that we didn't know if they would translate to the world stage. So far, Top Esports has been better than T1, and that means I have to predict them to win this series. But again, T1's had their number over the course of this year. I would not be surprised at all if T1 ends up taking this. But the final series in the quarterfinals, the biggest mismatch, really the only one that's not particularly close, Gen.G taking on FlyQuest. FlyQuest is going to blow them out of the water. Obviously, I'm kidding. Gen.G is going to obliterate them. This is not close. NA is happy to be here. They're happy to have gotten through. We had the Civil War, and one of them was guaranteed, but we drew the best team in the world, and we have to take our L. If they win a game, if they even make a game close, I'm going to be super excited. If they have any kind of showing that is similar to what they showed against Hanwha Life, I'm going to be super excited about, that, but Chovy is going to make this a very quick series, I think, and Chovy and Canyon and, all of them. It's not going to be close. Gen.G is going to wipe the floor here, and when you're talking about Gen.G taking on T1 or Top Esports, I think that is a series that theoretically Gen.G could struggle with. If it's T1, I see them struggling much less. They just have T1's number. Chovy has Faker's number. That's kind of just been the case over their history, but Top Esports, I think, is kind of built to be able to beat a team like Gen.G. I just don't know if they are going to be able to. They were able to do it at the Esports World Cup. Certainly something to think about, but that was a best of 3. It's really hard to take too much away from that. I think Gen.G is a team that I'm expecting to go to the finals, and if you're keeping track, that means my projected finals is Gen.G versus Hanwha Life Esports, a rematch not only of something that we saw on the Swiss stage, but of course the summer split finals in the LCK. I think they're the two best teams left at this tournament, and they're on the opposite sides of the bracket. I do see the other big option is Gen.G versus Bilibili. Again, if BLG is able to take down HLE and is able to start leveling up, they should be able to make the finals, but that's my prediction. I'm interested to see what you guys think of it, but that's our draw. That's going to be the rest of the tournament. Would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions on the draw, on the games, on all of that down in the comment section below. Are you excited by the games that we got, or did you want a different configuration? Always love hearing your thoughts and opinions, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Let me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of this tournament, quarterfinals, semifinals, grand finals. We'll be covering the off-season once that's over, and everything that has to do with that. We've got a lot of content piled up for you guys through the rest of the year. I hope you are excited, and if you are, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all